Hi, welcome to Museum Monthly. I'm Lucas,
I'm Rafi.
and today we're here with Nick Foster. He's going to tell us about Leadbelly. So, what are some things you could tell us about Leadbelly?
Yeah, so Leadbelly is a name that most people probably don't recognize, but he's an extremely influential musician. He was born Huddy Ledbetter. How he got the nickname Leadbelly is a little up for dispute, but quite frankly, Ledbetter lends itself to Leadbelly pretty easily. There's not a lot known about Leadbelly's early life, but we do know that he ended up in prison in the in the 1930s down in Louisiana. He was born in Texas, but ended up in prison in Louisiana. Over an incident, he claimed self-defense, but he supposedly killed a man in Louisiana and ended up in a prison in Louisiana. While he was in prison, he garnered a reputation as a great folk blues musician, and we can see in the image behind you that him playing his guitar, and he played actually like concerts while he was in prison. So there were two men by the name of John Lomax and his son Alan Lomax. They were music folklorists, essentially. They were music teachers, and they were really interested in collecting American folk music during the Great Depression. So in 1934, they heard about Leadbelly down in prison and went down to hear him play, and were so sort of enamored, amazed by his skill, that they wanted to get him out of prison and bring him somewhere where he could record music and play concerts. The warden of the prison at the time basically was like, you can have him if you keep him out of trouble. So, and he needs a job. So the Lomaxes hired him as their chauffeur. He didn't really have experience as a chauffeur, but it was an easy job for them to give him. So they wanted originally to bring him to New York City, but ran into some issues. Obviously, as an African-American man in the 1930s, he wasn't welcome in a lot of places. And the Lomaxes were also not welcome in a lot of places that Leadbelly was actually allowed to stay. So they were sort of frantically looking around for a place that they could kind of keep him out of trouble, but it would still be close to their sort of headquarters in New York City. So a friend of theirs actually had a house here on Belden Hill in Wilton. So in January of 1935, the Lomaxes moved into this house with Leadbelly and his then girlfriend, Martha. So January 9th, 1935, they moved in. Leadbelly actually got married 2 weeks later, right here in Wilton.
Oh, wow.
So he actually got his marriage license from the town clerk here in Wilton. And then they had the ceremony in the living room of the house in Wilton. And Alan Lomax was his best man because it was a small ceremony. So from there, Leadbelly spent about 3 months in Wilton during the winter into the spring of 1935. They recorded nearly 90 songs, various folk songs and blues songs here both in Wilton and in New York City, and then released an album basically of Leadbelly singing these traditional African-American folk and blues songs. And then Leadbelly went on to be quite famous throughout the rest of his life, released several different albums. We actually have one original album at the Historical Society in our collection, but lived out the rest of his life, and his music went on to influence dozens of musicians. Actually, George Harrison of the Beatles actually said if it wasn't for Leadbelly, there wouldn't be the Beatles because they loved his music so much.
Wow.
But we're fortunate enough actually to have us, in addition to the album from Leadbelly, we actually have a note written by Leadbelly's wife, Martha, near the end of his life in the late 1940s, when he was actually having some medical issues. And it's a letter from Martha asking a woman if she had heard any information from the doctor about Leadbelly's condition. So it's sort of a look into the man as opposed to sort of the myth that Leadbelly becomes. But yeah, we had Bob Dylan. There was a lot of folk music that came out of the folk movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Does it extend from Leadbelly? Bob Dylan was one of said he loved Leadbelly and was influenced. There was that Timothy Chalamet Bob Dylan movie that just came out, and that wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for Leadbelly. So yeah, he was an interesting character who only spent a brief amount of time in Wilton, but was thank God he did, or else a lot of this music may not exist.
Yeah. do we do anything here in Wilton to like acknowledge him? And because I know he was like a huge inspiration to many. I'm sure here in Wilton as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, because he was only in Wilton for a short time, I don't think people realize his association with the town. We at the Historical Society certainly try to we actually have a display of his stuff in our main lobby that you can check out. Actually, the album that we have in the collection, so we try to share his story. Many years ago, we did a Leadbelly tribute concert, so we're really trying to extend the legacy of Leadbelly and let people know how sort of foundational of a musician he was for American music. But unfortunately, if you don't come to the Historical Society or watch this video, you may not know Leadbelly was here in Wilton.
Yeah.
But he's, it's interesting as Wilton has had so many artists over the years because we're close to New York City, but also sort of out of the way. Same thing with Dave Brubeck, Wilton's other famous musician, was a guy who worked a lot in New York City, but wanted a quiet place sort of outside, but still accessible, and moved to Wilton. So Wilton's location seems to draw many artists who are looking for sort of that city connection, but also out somewhere peaceful to write and create.
Wow. Thank you so much for telling us about Leadbelly, and that was it for today's episode.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.